The federal government released the emissions reductions plan today in Vancouver, and oil and gas was prominent in it because there's a 42% reduction in emissions by 2030. And then that provoked some very controversial comments from former Alberta NDP Premier Rachel Notleys. So I'm going to talk to George Hoberg, who is a professor at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia, about it. So welcome to the interview, George.
Good afternoon.
So first of all, let's talk about the oil and gas reduction. It is 42% below 2019 levels, which are set at about that were 191 megatons a year. So 42% equals 80 megatons within, let's say, 8 years. That sounds like a big escalation in ambition from the federal government.
It does indeed. We knew in advance that the government was planning an oil and gas cap. We don't actually have a plan for how to achieve that cap, but we have a number now for how they see that reduction happening and how they see that fitting into their overall climate reduction ambitions.
This has got to be particularly problematic for the industry, for the oil sands, because it said it was going to rely 50 to 60% of its emissions on carbon capture and storage, which takes a long time to plan, engineer, and then build. We don't even have a federal investment credit for it yet. That's promised in the next budget. So it's really, I don't know how the industry is going to reduce its emissions that much unless it takes a different tact other than CCUS.
Well, remember that the oil industry has committed to net zero by 2050. Sooner or later, it's going to have to start moving in that direction, and actually extremely quickly. And what I see this number doing, it's actually sending a message that it's time to actually seriously begin doing this now. That's actually overdue, but from my perspective, it's quite a welcome message.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I'm on record in a number of columns criticizing the industry for moving far too slowly, embedded by the current government in Alberta. Well, let's talk about Rachel Notley's comments, and I'll read just a couple of them for our viewers as background. So she said in a press release, "This is not a real plan to reduce emissions, and in fact, it obstructs the rollout of a real plan that addresses climate change." And then she said, "Without massive changes in technology across every sector and huge changes in global energy demand, reaching the 2030 target in just over 7 years is fantasy." What's your response to that?
Well, she actually may be right. This is a very bold commitment by the government. I mean, if you can call it that. What it is, it's really a notional modeling target. And she's absolutely right that there is no plan for it yet. And among the shortcomings of this plan is that the oil and gas cap is still a plan to have a plan. The new thing is that we actually have a number that's a target that plan should meet, but there's no kind of legislative or regulatory requirement that it do that. This is just a target to have as a goal for the plan to meet the plan. We were just discussing how incredibly complicated this will be, how complacent the industry has been thus far in starting to move in this direction. So it's a big, bold target, and we're going to need to dramatically shift the way we do business in the oil sector. Frankly, I do think it is a big ask, but again, it's long overdue. What I get frustrated by in Canada is that we still keep tiptoeing around the massive changes required in the Alberta economy and in the Alberta oil sector in order to meet Canada's 2050 climate commitments and certainly our 2030 climate targets as well.
Well, I've got sources in Ottawa who tell me that the Prime Minister's office has been frustrated as well. And I can't help but think that this is a shocking target because somebody needed in Alberta, but basically the politicians and the industry needed to be shocked.
Yes, I think that's true. I assume that the people in the Prime Minister's office, I don't talk to them, have been actively trying to get conversations going with the highest levels of the Alberta government. And I assume that's been relatively unsuccessful because of the ideology of the current government in power. If Canada wants to be a responsible global citizen in terms of climate, it needs to begin acting now. And if it needs to do that, it needs to find a way to have some kind of a serious conversation with Alberta. And that is so far overdue, it's quite sad. And I do hope that this new target kind of shocks the government and the industry into a more serious conversation with other parties in Canada about making these kinds of reductions on the timescale required.
Well, that brings me to another question, which is about the federal GHG offset system that is mentioned in the emissions reduction plan. Offsets have come in for an awful lot of criticism lately as being just a way to sort of greenwash, emitters' activities. And one could see a plan by the industry to say, okay, you want 75% methane emission reductions by 2030. We'll give you that. And then the rest of it will just purchase offsets. And we won't make any substantive, action towards really making absolute reductions. What's your take on that?
So I do think that is a significant risk. And the climate policy wonks have been concerned about reliance and discussions about offsets for quite some time. I'm a person who, I'm not in principle opposed to the idea of offsets. I think they can be a cost-effective way to reduce emissions, but they need to be properly accounted for and regulated. And we're still in the early stages of getting the system under the UN Framework for Climate Change to do that. If those rules come in effect in a rigorous way, I would be open-minded to using them in a modest way to meet Canada's commitments, but only if that is the case. I'm actually a bit more concerned about this broader rhetoric around net zero and around the CCS thing that you mentioned, because in a lot of ways, the idea of net zero oil is a myth that the oil industry has promoted in Canada as a way to kind of maintain peace. The fact is that we can reduce emissions from producing oil and gas to zero, but the combustion of oil and gas, its end product, which is by far the highest fraction of its life cycle emissions, we can't reduce in the same way through CCUS or other mechanisms. And so this idea of that we're going to go to net zero oil in Canada, but somewhere in the rest of the world, they're going to take our oil and combust it and produce all those emissions elsewhere. It means we're really betting on a world in which we're not meeting our 1.5 degree or 2 degree targets. And so I really get concerned about this emphasis on net zero. I'd much prefer it to be something around as close to zero as possible.
Fair enough. Let's talk about carbon pricing, because there was a significant section in the emissions reduction plan on carbon pricing, but it didn't say anything new. And it didn't even, there was a lot of vague language about durable carbon pricing and so on that I don't think meant anything to anybody. But the thing that wasn't mentioned is that for industrial emitters like the oil and gas industry in Alberta, they come under an equivalency agreement between the feds and the Alberta government, and they basically get an 80 to 90% discount on their carbon price. Now, if there was any low-hanging fruit where you wanted to increase, apply a little bit of pressure to the industry to reduce their emissions, that seems to me to be low-hanging fruit, and the government didn't even address it.
So the emission pricing part of the federal government's framework, was announced earlier, and they didn't change that. All they have suggested in this plan is they want to find a way to communicate its future certainty. That's obviously challenging. With respect to the OBPS issues that you mentioned and the credits people get, it's actually the marginal price. It's the most important driver. Not the overall price, the average price. But setting that aside for the moment, I think the big news out of this plan is not that it didn't increase the carbon pricing framework. It's the new oil and gas cap. That's going to be the future driver for oil and gas emissions, not the relative price. The relative price is going up. The marginal price will be going up, and that will affect the incentives to expand oil and gas production, but it's that oil and gas cap, once it gets put in place, that will be the biggest constraint on oil and gas behavior.
Now, I want to end our conversation, George, with an issue that isn't talked about much, and that is as long as there have been increases in oil supply out of Canada, there has never been a reduction in absolute emissions from that sector. And the Environment Canada is forecasting that between now and 2030, oil supply will increase by 900,000 barrels a day. That's almost 20% more than we produce now. It's hard to see how, given that, I mean, let me put it this way, that whatever we've talked about in this conversation about how difficult it'll be, that fact, if it comes true, makes it just that much more difficult.
Yeah, I think that may have been the reference case and not the actual projections under this, but I haven't dug into those numbers yet. But your overall point is definitely a fair one. We need to reduce emissions from global energy supply to virtually zero as soon as possible and by 2050, if we're going to be able to meet that 1.5 degree target. And that's why this conversation around net zero oil production is really a myth. Okay, we can reduce Canadian oil and gas emissions to relatively small amounts, but if we're distributing those products around the world where they're being combusted, the global atmosphere doesn't care where that combustion is occurring, whether it's in Canada or in China. It just cares whether or not there's emissions. And so that really raises serious questions about the future of all fossil fuels. And in Canada, our big issue is the oil and gas sector. We need to dramatically reduce not only emissions, but production in order to be able to meet global climate targets.
George, always appreciate your insights. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you, Markham.